Good afternoon, good evening, one and all. Thanks for joining us in this episode of the SRE Practitioner Series. I'm absolutely delighted to have today an esteemed guest, an SRE expert, and has done a lot of roles. So please join me in welcoming Niall Murphy, joining us all the way from Ireland. Thank you, Niall, for joining us today and sharing your insights around the world of SRE. I hope you're doing well and staying safe.
Doing my best. We are looking outside at wonderful November sunshine in Dublin, Ireland. That is not a phrase which is used very often, wonderful November sunshine in Dublin, Ireland. But anyway, today it's not too bad.
Excellent. So Niall, give our viewers a quick rundown of your experience journey and what really fascinated you on the SRE space.
Sure. So as you can probably tell from my lack of hair, I've been in the industry for a reasonably long time. I kind of started my journey with internet infrastructure stuff in the whisper it mid-90s. I've actually written a kind of online book about my time at the start of the growth of the internet industry in Ireland, which is available at www.internethistory.ie. But actually, probably most of your viewers or listeners would care about the SRE portion of it. The SRE portion of it really starts, I suppose, in 2006 or thereabouts, when I joined Google. Initially, I actually joined their SysOps team, which is not their SRE team for various reasons, I suppose. But actually, because Google is growing very violently at that period, and it's still its early history, I suppose, at that stage. Even though I come in the door ostensibly working on one team, reporting to one person, and so on and so forth, within, I think, 4 months, I have changed manager once, desks twice or 3 times, and shortly end up getting folded into the SRE function in Dublin, again within months, and without training, which was pretty awesome, but that's fine. The the course of my career from there, particularly with respect to SRE, is I spend, I suppose, the bulk of my 11 years in Google. No, that's not quite true. About half of my 11 years as an individual contributor, which is where I learn kind of the nuts and bolts of service management, I suppose, and then the rest of it I spend as a manager of various kinds. I suppose I manage a team of 4 at the earliest stages, and then I end up managing directly and matrix managing a team of roughly 110 in the ads reliability space. And then I go back down to being an individual contributor again shortly before I leave Google. So I've done IC manager a lot. And then I suppose I moved to Microsoft to start the local instance of a group then known as Production Infrastructure Engineering, which has software folks in it who do stuff like they make the tools that manage the clouds. So there's the monitoring system and the alerting system and so on, and also SREs. And then a couple of months into that, I become, I am field promoted to global lead of that function, which I do for a couple of years. And now, post-pandemic, I am out on my own doing consultancy and exploring opportunities. So that's the long story.
Excellent, Niall. So this episode that we are doing is to bring in real-world practitioners to share their insights around the world of SRE, some practical do's and don'ts, some of the myths that we can unravel and unearth as we start to talk about. So let me start out with my first question. So many of the times, when we talk about error budgets, people understand the value of error budgets. They understand it's an opportunity to experiment, accept failure as normal. But people struggle to see how can you implement error budgets in reality, right? Because it's not a funding, and particularly when you're trying to work with product teams, how does error budgets get implemented? What are some of those steps that we need to take in consideration? How has that been useful for organizations to take benefit of that experimentation and handling failures?
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose the overall framing of your series being practitioner-led, that's certainly a good thing and a great thing in the context of SRE, of course. I feel slightly fake attending this because I don't practition much. I think about the issues and I tell other people how to practition, which is like maybe not precisely what you want. But I will say I have been thinking about error budgets for a long while, and I'm not convinced that the experimentation budget is entirely the right framing in order to make this concept kind of digestible by teams generally. I suppose where I have ended up with them, with error budgets, is basically believing or saying that an error budget is strongly related to this agreement that you make about what the user experience should be, typically expressed as this number of 9s and 5s or whatever, right? But you have one behavior, one side of that line, which is ship features, run things, launch, launch, launch.
Right.
And because it's a line and because it's a boundary condition, you have to have a behavior on the other side of the line as well.
Right.
And that behavior has to be different. Well, what is the different behavior? Well, the logical opposite is not launch, launch, launch. And the thing that error budgets is, I suppose, in some sense designed to do or intended to do, even though some of that's a bit hazy, but the thing it's kind of supposed to do is to basically say to development teams, look, there is a valid reason not to just launch features all of the time.
Right.
And that organizational pressure that lands on development teams, they're incentivized to launch features, the product gets more important when it gets more users or more money flows through it, so on and so forth. That pressure is something for which there should be some kind of countervailing pressure to guard the user experience that you have agreed. And so I really frame error budgets in that context rather than the experimentation piece, because I think the notion of it being a budget implies that you have some discretion about how it is spent, which is in some sense true, I suppose. But the budget piece is, I feel, it's almost advanced error budgets. Early stage or intermediate error budgets are, okay, we launched until something bad happened, and now we have to have a different behavior on the other side of that line until we go back across it. The difficulties, so that model I have seen actually work quite well. I've been on teams where there was, a very large outage, the user experience was damaged considerably, and the development team understood that damaging the user experience was actually a bad thing and required different behavior, and they cooperated very strongly with the SRE team to put in new reliability measures into place, and the overall system became more reliable and predictable and so on as a result. So it can work quite well as a kind of a first order concept, but it does have a couple of weaknesses. I mean, not just this question of whether or not people understand what the construct is or how they should change their behavior, but also kind of theoretical edge cases. For example, you have decided some user experience level, and then you have a really very bad outage indeed. For example, I suppose that Roblox, which had a kind of multi-weekend, it sometimes feels like, outage recently, their error budget is gone for the rest of the year, or possibly a couple of years.
Right.
I don't think they're going to stop shipping features for a couple of years, right? So there's an edge case about what happens if you have a very large reliability event. And there's bits and pieces of other edge cases, but that's more or less how I understand it and how I work with it with my clients today.
Right, absolutely. I think to be honest, that at the end of the day, we are here to serve the business. So if you blow up your error budget, you cannot say that as an excuse and then sit idle. We're going to be kicked out of this whole place. So business wants to really get that momentum going in, but I like that, to look at the boundary line to see how do you have a sense of balance. Do you have also consequences that you have actually implemented where when something breaches with error budgets, we all agree that there are no more releases or launches until we get things into place and kind of a common shared ownership across the pipeline or the value stream?
Yes, I've been in places where that I'll call it a social contract for the moment, because it's certainly not a formal one, right? But I've been in places where that social contract has been observed. I have been in places where that social contract has not been observed. And those are kind of trickier places for SREs to exert value in, because if the primary value of the SRE, and I'll come back to something you said there in a moment, because I think it's important. If the primary value of the SRE is user experience, the guarding of the user experience, and the development team refuses to guard the user experience, like, they'll win. I mean, there's as they say in the security world, there's not that much you can do against a sufficiently determined attacker.
Right.
But I would prefer not to frame things in that way. And I would say that, generally speaking, if an SRE or SRE team comes to a counterpart team with user experience, with the defense of the user experience in mind, and with pretty reasonable data showing what's going on, then usually a good conversation can be had. Just want to come back to something that you said earlier with respect to, I mean, we're all here for the business at the end of the day. That sentence has some nuance in it, in the sense that the business, end quote, doesn't necessarily have a single interpretation of what is good for us.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So a business could, and we had this discussion a lot in Google and elsewhere as well, a business can behave in ways which are short-term profitable but long-term unprofitable, or like even in the kind of most hyper-capitalistic of organizations, there's usually some understanding that you can do terrible things to make a quick buck. Right. But if you want to make a long buck or long multiple bucks, you have to behave slightly differently. And I would say that one of the fascinating organizational characteristics of SRE is that it usually finds itself defending the long term rather than the short term.
Right. That's a fair point, right? If we go to the next one about, according to LinkedIn's 2020 report, they published the top 20 jobs, and number 4 is the full stack developer and number 5 is the site reliability engineer. So these two roles are kind of interchangeably used and people kind of get their own version. So what is your opinion around this, the role of a full stack developer and an SRE? Do they complement each other? Are they kind of competing against each other?
So I suppose the first thing to say is I'm not a hugely kind of competitive person. I'm not really inclined to bring that lens to understanding stuff. But the second thing I'd say is that we work in an industry which is a little bit like a linguistic meat grinder, which is to say that well-defined terms go in one end of the industry, then there's some and out the other end pops kind of nonsense. So when people say full stack developer, I always say to myself, like, okay, 4 JavaScript frameworks, like, is that a full stack developer? Or are you talking about being able to go from kernel all the way up to UI? So, I mean, leaving aside the question of definitions, of course, when you are this mythical beast, the full stack developer, equally able to write kernel code as JavaScript UI or whatever, you would have a very, very broad awareness of computing issues. And in particular, the closer you get to the hardware and drivers and areas where abstractions are either non-existent or extremely leaky, those kinds of issues that you encounter when you try and deal with, quotes, the real world, end quotes, more than folks who float on top of several layers of abstraction, but most famously probably libc or win32 or whatever the standard library is for your situation. Those folks are probably much closer to the mindset of an SRE with respect to understanding, oh, hey, actually, these things can go wrong, and in a very significant way, very easily. That mindset aligns well with kind of SRE interests. But the thing I would say differentiates them is really that if you are a full stack developer, that doesn't mean that you have any particular knowledge or background in like distributed systems or what it means to run a service. Like there's a corpus, there's a body of knowledge, including SLOs, narrow budgets, and all of the things we've been talking about so far, which are not things that you encounter when you are writing kernel code, and neither are they things you encounter when you're writing JavaScript necessarily, right? So I would say that they overlap more in concern than kind of more narrow, kind of product software engineering does, but there's still a pretty large gap, or a gap that can be large depending on your local environment.
Right, that's right. So, and I think completely agree in terms of looking at this holistically rather than just trying to compete against. I love the point that you don't want to compete. You want to play that together as fair and square, and how see the benefit overall for the organization as well as the team to do it. Now, a lot of times, Niall, when you talk it's site reliability engineering, they tend to see that, oh, okay, if you are in cloud natives, then site reliability engineering makes sense because you're looking at scalability, and it's a lot more easier and efficient from a tenant perspective. But what's your take on how SRE can take advantage of the principles and practices, even in monolithic applications or commercial off-the-shelf products, tools like SAP or ERP systems? What's the value that SREs can gain, considering that you still have a limitation on how this could be, tamed? Do you still see there is a value of doing it? Because most of the organizations still allow around the bi-model IT, right? Because the certain set of applications still run monolithic, and some towards containers, microservices, and whatnot. So if they are in this whole journey, what do you think would be advantages that SRE can leverage in their existing environments?
Yeah, so I think I'll tease apart some subcomponents of your question here for a moment. I don't regard monolithism necessarily as being an impediment to anything with respect to SRE approaches to software development or service management. Right. Like not even monorepo, right? You can still do SRE in a very large number of cases, even if you aren't entirely in the cloud and with monorepo and so on. Like loads of those things are effectively just distractions. I will say that there are certain kinds of things which present friction to SRE approaches. For example, if you have like an application which manages the air conditioning system, which runs on Windows 7 and can't run on Windows 10, and has no source code and just a single kind of GUI for managing, which can be authorized just from one host, and so on. Like there's a bunch of kind of friction-inducing steps you can introduce that make, I suppose, the application of software as operations kind of inherently more difficult.
Right.
Not impossible. I spent a good deal of time on a team in Google that managed some of the front end infrastructure a long while ago now, over a decade, I'd say. And that team and Google at that point used a piece of commercial kit called a NetScaler. I'm not even sure if they're still around. But they didn't have, I mean, source code, entirely proprietary hardware thing. I think it ran on FreeBSD, actually, if I recall correctly. Anyway, Amazon used them as well around that time period, and very, very large numbers of them. Anyway, so of course, NetScaler is proprietary, you don't have the source code, but what you do have is a management interface. And you're able, to a certain extent, kind of hackily, but definitely not nothing, write the equivalent of SSH expect scripts or automation that can talk to the boxes, configure VIPs, turn off VIPs, basically manage the devices in a software-driven way, which is the key differentiator. So if you say to me, how useful can SRE approaches be in general for applications? I think I'd point you at the 2018 Forrester report that went through the list of recommendations in the SRE book and says, oh, actually, like about half of these apply to more or less anyone, no matter what they're doing. And they're actually like reasonably common sense things, like you should agree what your user experience is. And, challenging questions like that. And about half of the practices, another half of the practices, you have to think about whether or not they make sense for your local environment. And then there's a teeny tiny, I think it's 4% or something like that, number of practices that only apply to the hyperscalers, really. Yeah. But broadly speaking, I would say it's not really about monolithism. There's very well publicized journeys for turning monoliths, for which you have the source code, into microservices. If that's what you want to do, actually, there's nothing that says necessarily that's the best thing to do in all circumstances, right? There are certain challenges if the things you're managing are not software driven or can't be API addressable. But there's more significant barriers to being an SRE if the cultural expectations of the organization you're within don't allow for the kind of cross-cutting horizontality, like horizontal glue between vertical silos that SRE typically does. If that isn't possible in your environment, you're just another silo, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're spot on. So what kind of skills do you think, Niall, would really qualify to be an SRE? Sometimes people think that SRE is like a Superman or a Superwoman, having a lot of these skills end to end, but typically you don't even get people who have that broader understanding from a breadth and depth perspective. So who do you think fits the bill to be qualified to be a site reliability engineer in whatever work they have been doing from the previous past?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question primarily because it kind of it raises the question of what credentialism means in our industry,
right?
And for this role in particular, I'm not a big fan of credentialism in the sense that if you model the SRE role as one that's being kind of very strongly practically oriented and wants to know what can be done in order to make things better and so on, you find yourself realizing that actually whether or not you have a degree from Stanford or University College Dublin or whatever, that probably doesn't make too much difference, statistically speaking, in whether or not you care about those things, right? So credential-wise, I mean, one of the other interesting things about the SRE function at Google is that I was surprised, possibly isn't the right word, but it always struck me how much the SREs in the function, certainly in the early days, had folks who had not made it all the way through university, or indeed possibly had no formal education in computer science at all. It's just a bunch of people who care deeply about a particular thing, and they're well equipped to learn. So this is the other thing. We often in the industry use credentialism as, okay, there's some guarantee that when company X hires individual Y already knows the vast bulk of the things they'll need to know in order to be effective from day one. So to some extent, we have dropped the time till they're useful compared to some other person we could hire who doesn't know all of the things. But actually, that's maybe not the best way to think of the situation, because often's the wrong word. Sometimes you encounter people who come in the door with some useful proportion, 80%, whatever, of the things they need to know, but those have been acquired over a very long time, and the person isn't maybe that interested in acquiring new knowledge. So I would pick somebody who learns faster and who cares about these issues over somebody who doesn't care, I suppose.
Right. Well, I was trying to refer to that when I say credentials in terms of the skills like development skills, coding skills, architectural skills. So it's more about those different functions. Do you have that T-shaped, I-shaped, T-shaped, pie-shaped, and comb-shaped skills where you have been more versatile in trying to adopt to any of the stuff? It could be applications side of things, it could be infrastructure management, it could be the middle tier. So those kind of skills, to get some knowledge and experience around the end-to-end value chain to be more readily deployable in a context of how your environment needs you to be leveraged as an SRE.
Yeah, and I suppose my instinct and background and all the rest of that is I have I embarrassingly have systems, software, and network engineering background. So I think in this way naturally. I think end to end. I understand that when you draw a box and you go, router or whatever, there's significant complexity in that box you've just drawn on the whiteboard. And I understand that when you draw a box going data, there's significant complexity in that box. Right, all of it, all of these boxes should be inspectable by the SRE. There should be no haunted graveyards. There should be nothing that the SRE is afraid of. The SRE is curious about how things operate. And so how work, I suppose. And so coming back to your question about skills, the thing I would look for is, in some sense, a negation of what you're saying. I would look for things in the background which are not narrow.
Right.
I don't want somebody who has taken, like, to pick a random example, who has done SRE for machine learning for the past 20 years. I mean, of course, machine learning hasn't existed for 20 years. And just knows that and is kind of not very comfortable with moving outside of that comfort zone. So I look for a broad background.
Excellent. That makes sense. So what are some of the metrics that you think SRE can be tracked for value to the business? Because traditionally we have measured people around deployment frequency, lead time, cycle time, change failure rates. So as that changes the whole dimension from a user experience, I know we talk a little bit about SLOs part of it, but is there any specific quantifiable or qualitative metrics that you can attach to SREs from a deliverable standpoint as well as a value standpoint of business?
So to my mind, that question strikes me as a little odd, because it is effectively saying, can you tell me in an entirely context-free way what your business should value? To which the answer is no.
Correct.
Are there a bunch of things that SREs are typically involved in which have metrics in them, and the metrics relate to the user experience, and the user experience is important? Oh, yes. Yeah. But like, it's very different between a image hosting website to a CI/CD system to a machine learning model building as a service SaaS platform. Like, all of those would have pretty different kind of characteristics. And the important thing, coming back to this view of SREs as guardians of the user experience, the important thing is being able to map those user journeys, as they say, like the user interacting with the service and getting value out of the service, and being able to relate those back to the metrics that are exposed by the system. And if they aren't exposed by the system, first job of the SRE is to put in the hooks and metrics for doing that kind of observability. Otherwise, you just don't have a notion what's going on with the user. And I think that would be the first thing to solve.
Great. So how do you develop the right team structure when it comes to implementing an SRE model? We have been talking about squads and pods and tribes. I don't know whether it's still being effective. I know with Spotify coming in and they experimenting on that stuff, but what would you suggest to be an appropriate right team structure for SRE to kind of take that baton from where we start off from Agile to DevOps to SRE and make that really worthwhile exercise to have that end-to-end ownership?
Yep. I mean, again, it's a little bit like the previous question. I'm not sure there's a context-free way to answer that for everyone, but I will say a couple of things. First one is that I've had a good time reading a book called Team Topologies, which I think is by Matthew Skelton, which does a good job of explaining not just the two types of teams that most people are familiar with. It's a 90-10 relationship, siloed team versus horizontal team, right? Most people understand siloed team very, very well, and they go from siloed team to siloed team in their career, and then one time out of 10, they might encounter horizontal. But it does a good job of explaining other kind of characteristics as well, or other kind of team arrangements, kind of ad hoc project teams swarming on some particular thing, and infrastructure support teams and so on. So there is, I suppose, the first thing to say to your viewers is there's more diversity there of team arrangements than you might expect, and it's good to broaden your understanding of these things. Having said that, by default, I suppose the most well-known one in the SRE space is the kind of long-running piece of infrastructure or application support team, typically 6 plus or minus a bunch, and those folks are a team which partner strongly, usually with some other kind of development team. Again, whether it's application or infrastructure, doesn't matter too much, but basically a partnership style configuration. That doesn't work for all organizations. And in particular, it doesn't necessarily work for all hiring rates or organizational mandates or so on and so forth. For example, hypothetical example, but you can probably extrapolate from it to your local situation. An organization is faced with some kind of reliability challenge. Reliability challenges are usually holistic. They're not things which are going to be entirely created or entirely solved within the context of just one team. And so the organization standing back and looking at, it's a 100-person engineering org or whatever goes, actually, we probably need some reliability expertise kind of distributed throughout this organization, so a concentrated team doesn't make much sense. Okay, then what you can do is you can do the embedded model, where SREs kind of sit with other teams potentially for quite long periods, which of course creates its own problems if maybe you go native or whatever it is. But in those configurations, either consulting or embedded, other words are used, you kind of smear the expertise over a wide number of teams because maybe that's the most appropriate response to the challenge that you're faced with. Another configuration you can do is a little bit like that, in that you have some kind of embedding going on, but it's more in a consulting role, where instead of doing a tour of duty for 6 months or whatever, you have a specific project or a thing to achieve, and it's a swarm model on that until it's shipped, and then you go and do something else. I suppose my own observations would be that one of the organizational distinctions between DevOps and SRE, as I understand it, is that an SRE organization is typically more concentrated and spends time thinking about what it means to manage services in the abstract. And DevOps folks are usually strongly located within the context of a product team doing things specifically for that service, and they're not so interested, and it's not so relevant to their daily life about, oh, hey, here's this interesting corner case about what it means to manage data pipelines when you happen to not be in a data pipeline team. So I think there's significant benefits to the individuals within the SRE team, the more kind of concentrated they are, because the more they can think about these issues, develop communities of practice, so on and so forth. And when they're distributed like dust throughout an organization, it's harder to get that critical mass, but sometimes that configuration is useful for achieving particular organizational goals.
Right. I think this is great, and I think we can talk for hours over this whole topics, Niall. But thank you so much for sharing your valuable views about site-reliability engineering and different facets from your own experience standpoint. I'm sure that our viewers would have gained immense takeaways from this session, and thank you so much again. And for viewers, I hope you enjoyed the session from Niall, talking about some of those current challenges and how we can plan to mitigate that. We'll be back again for the next edition of the SRE Practitioner Connect. Until then, stay tuned. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, please subscribe to TaUB Solutions YouTube channel. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again in the next edition. Thank you again, Niall, for your time today.
No worries. Cheers.